Story 1. I never thought much about the old house at the end of Maple Street. It was just another rundown place in our small town, a relic from a time long past. But one chilly autumn evening, curiosity got the better of me. It started when I found an old key in my grandmother's attic. The key was large, rusty, and had intricate designs etched into it. Attached to it was a faded tag that read, Maple Street. I asked my grandmother about it, but she grew pale and told me to forget I ever saw it. Of course, that only made me more curious. Against my better judgment, I decided to visit the old house. The sun was setting as I approached, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. The house looked abandoned, with broken windows and a door that hung slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped onto the creaking porch. I took a deep breath and inserted the key into the lock. To my surprise, it turned smoothly, and the door swung open with a loud groan. Inside, the house was dark and musty. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and dust coated every surface. I called out, "Hello?" But only silence answered. Using the flashlight on my phone, I began to explore. Old furniture covered with white sheets filled the rooms. Portraits with eyes that seemed to follow me adorned the walls. As I moved deeper into the house, a cold breeze brushed past me, and I shivered. In the back of the house, I found a staircase leading to the basement. The door was locked, but the same key opened it. The steps creaked under my weight as I descended. The air grew colder, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. At the bottom, I found a room lit by flickering candles. Strange symbols were drawn on the walls, and in the center was a large mirror. Intrigued, I walked toward it. My reflection looked back at me, but something was off. My reflection was smiling, but I wasn't. I stepped back in fear, but my reflection remained in place, grinning wickedly. Suddenly, it reached out from the mirror and grabbed my arm. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The cold grip pulled me toward the mirror's surface, which rippled like water. Just as I was about to be pulled in, the candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. The grip loosened and I fell backward onto the floor. Gasping for air, I scrambled to my feet and raced up the stairs. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air filling my lungs. The house loomed behind me, silent and foreboding. I looked back at the windows and saw my reflection staring back at me, still smiling. I raced home and slammed the door behind me. I thought I was safe, but strange things started happening. Mirrors in my house showed that same eerie grin, shadows moved on their own, and whispers filled the night. Desperate, I returned to my grandmother and told her everything. Her eyes filled with tears as she revealed the truth. Our family had been the guardians of that mirror for generations, tasked with keeping the evil trapped within. By using the key, I had released whatever was inside. The only way to stop it was to go back and face it. With a heavy heart, I agreed. Armed with an old book of spells and my grandmother by my side, we returned to the house. The journey to the basement was even more terrifying than before. The house seemed alive, doors slamming on their own and floors shaking. In the basement, the mirror awaited us. My reflection and countless others sneered from its surface. Together, we began the ritual. The air grew thick and the ground trembled. The reflections screamed and writhed as we chanted. With a final shout, the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. Silence fell, and the oppressive darkness lifted. We sighed in relief, believing it was over. But as we turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the shattered glass. Multiple reflections of myself, all grinning wickedly. It's been weeks since that night, and things haven't been the same. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I see my reflection moving on its own. In mirrors, windows, even puddles, it's always there, watching me with that sinister smile. I fear that by breaking the mirror, we didn't destroy the evil, we set it free, and now it's a part of me. Every night, the whispers grow louder. Sleep evades me, and shadows twist into horrifying shapes. I'm afraid to look into any reflective surface, fearing what I'll see. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The line between reality and nightmare is blurring. If you find an old key or feel drawn to a place you should avoid, heed my warning. Some doors are locked for a reason, and some reflections are best left unseen. Story 2. I never thought that taking a job in a small, quiet town would lead me to the most terrifying experience of my life. It all started when I accepted a position as the new caretaker of Hollow Creek Manor. The manor was a grand, old house perched on a hill overlooking the town. The locals whispered tales about it being haunted, but I didn't believe in such things. To me, it was just a job and a place to stay. The day I arrived, the sky was overcast and a light drizzle fell from the gray clouds. I pulled up to the manor, admiring its aged beauty. The stone walls were covered in ivy, and tall windows lined the front. It looked like something out of a storybook. Mr. Thompson, the man who hired me, greeted me at the door. He was an elderly gentleman with kind eyes. "Welcome," he said, shaking my hand. "I hope you find the manor to your liking." "I'm sure I will," I replied with a smile. He showed me around the house, pointing out the rooms I was responsible for maintaining. The interior was filled with antique furniture, ornate rugs, and paintings that seemed centuries old. "There's just one rule," Mr. Thompson said, his tone turning serious. "The east wing is off limits. It's unsafe due to structural issues." I nodded. Understood. For the first few days, everything was peaceful. I spent my time cleaning, organizing, and exploring the allowed areas of the manor. At night, I would sit by the fireplace, reading books from the vast library. But then strange things began to happen. One evening, as I was dusting the shelves in the library, I heard faint music. It sounded like an old piano tune coming from somewhere in the house. I followed the sound, but as soon as I tried to pinpoint its source, it stopped. I mentioned it to Mr. Thompson the next day. "Ah, you must have heard the wind," he said dismissively. "This old house makes all sorts of noises." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't press the matter. That night, I was awoken by soft footsteps outside my room. I got up and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. I shrugged it off, thinking it might be the old floorboards settling. But the occurrences became more frequent. Doors would open and close on their own. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. Once, I found a porcelain doll sitting on a chair in the parlor, even though I had never seen it before. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to find out what was in the east wing. Late one night, when Mr. Thompson was away in town, I made my way to the door that led to the forbidden area. It was locked, but with a hairpin, I managed to unlock it. The air inside was cold, and a musty smell filled my nose. The hallway was dark, and the wallpaper was peeling off the walls. As I walked, the wooden floor creaked under my feet. I entered a room that appeared to be a child's bedroom. Toys were scattered on the floor, and a small bed sat against the wall. On a dresser, there was a music box. I opened it, and the same tune I had heard before began to play. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned around and saw a little girl standing in the doorway. She had long, dark hair and wore an old-fashioned dress. "Hello?" I said softly. She didn't respond. Instead, she pointed toward the window. I looked in that direction, but saw nothing unusual. When I turned back, she was gone. Feeling uneasy, I decided to leave the east wing. As I hurried back, I heard whispers behind me, but when I looked, no one was there. The next morning, I confronted Mr. Thompson. "Mr. Thompson, I need to know what's going on in this house," I demanded. He sighed heavily. "I was hoping you wouldn't get involved," he said, "but I suppose you have a right to know." He led me to the sitting room and began to tell me the history of Hollow Creek Manor. "Many years ago, the manor belonged to the Whitmore family," he began. "They were wealthy but reclusive. They had a daughter named Emily. She was a sweet child but fell ill and passed away at a young age. Mrs. Whitmore was devastated and couldn't accept her death. She began practicing dark rituals, trying to bring Emily back." "What happened to them?" I asked, leaning forward. "One night, there was a terrible fire in the east wing. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore were never seen again. Some say their spirits, along with Emily's, still linger here." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I didn't want to scare you away," he admitted. "I thought the spirits had settled, but perhaps they've become active again." "Is there anything we can do?" I asked. He shook his head. "I've tried everything. Priests, cleansings, you name it, but nothing seems to work." Determined to help, I decided to do some research on my own. I spent hours in the library, reading old journals and newspapers. I found references to a ritual that could appease restless spirits. I gathered the necessary items, candles, herbs, and a locket that belonged to Emily, which I found in the east wing. That night, I set up the ritual in the old child's bedroom. As I began the ceremony, the temperature dropped. The candles flickered, and whispers filled the air. "Emily," I called out gently. "We're here to help you find peace." The little girl appeared again, her eyes filled with sadness. "Mommy won't let me go," she whispered. "Where is your mother?" I asked. Suddenly a cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. A dark figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with hollow eyes and a twisted expression. "Leave us," she screeched. I stood my ground. "You need to let Emily go," I said firmly. "She deserves to rest." "Never," the woman screamed, and the room shook violently. Just then, Mr. Thompson burst into the room. "Elizabeth," he shouted at the apparition. "It's time to let her go." The woman's gaze shifted to him. "You," she hissed. "Yes, it's me," he said. "I've lived with this guilt for too long. I should have saved her." I looked at him, confused. "Mr. Thompson, what are you talking about?" He lowered his head. "I was the caretaker back then. I saw what Mrs. Whitmore was doing, but I didn't stop her. I was too afraid." The ghostly figure of Mrs. Whitmore lunged toward him. "You could have saved us," she wailed. "I'm sorry," he whispered. In that moment, the spirit of Emily stepped between them. "It's okay, Mommy," she said softly. "I'm ready to go." Mrs. Whitmore's face softened. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks. "My sweet girl," she murmured. A bright light filled the room, and both spirits began to fade. Before disappearing completely, Emily turned to me and smiled. "Thank you," she said. The room fell silent. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the manor lifted. Mr. Thompson and I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. "I think they're finally at peace," I said. He nodded. "Thanks to you." From that day on, the manor felt different, warmer, more welcoming. The strange occurrences stopped, and I continued my duties without fear. But one night, as I was closing up the library, I heard faint laughter. Emily's laughter. It wasn't scary or unsettling. It was as if she was saying goodbye one last time. I smiled and whispered, "Good night, Emily." Years have passed since then, and I've become the full-time caretaker of Hollow Creek Manor. Mr. Thompson retired and moved to a cottage nearby. The manor has even become a place where people come to admire its beauty, no longer shrouded in dark tales. But I will never forget the events that took place. They taught me that some stories are true, and sometimes the past doesn't rest until we confront it. So if you ever find yourself in a place with a history, listen to the whispers, pay attention to the shadows, and remember that sometimes the most ordinary places can hold the deepest secrets. Because not all ghosts are meant to haunt. Some just need help finding their way home. Story 3. I never used to believe in the supernatural. My life was ordinary, filled with the usual routines and mundane tasks, but that all changed when the clock struck 3:33 a.m. One night, I jolted awake, my heart pounding. The room was eerily quiet, but something felt off. Glancing at my alarm clock, the glowing numbers read 3:33 a.m. I shrugged it off as a random awakening and tried to go back to sleep. Just then, I heard a faint creaking noise coming from downstairs. Curiosity got the better of me, so I got up to investigate. As I descended the stairs, the shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper. Suddenly, shadowy figures began to materialize around me, their forms flickering like black flames. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The figures didn't follow, but their whispers echoed in my mind, until, without warning, everything went black. I woke up again, gasping for air. The clock read 3:33 a.m. Confused, I wondered if it had all been a nightmare. But the creaking noise started anew. This time, I decided to hide. I crawled under my bed, holding my breath as the shadowy figures entered my room. They moved silently, almost gliding across the floor. One of them paused right beside the bed, and I could feel a cold chill permeate the air. After what felt like an eternity, they left, and darkness consumed me once more. Again, I awoke at 3:33 a.m. Realization hit me. I was trapped in some kind of time loop. Each time, the shadowy figures appeared, and no matter what I did to escape or hide, I always ended up back at the beginning. Desperate to break the cycle, I tried everything I could think of. I screamed for help, but no sound seemed to penetrate the still night. I attempted to leave the house, but the doors wouldn't budge, and the windows were unbreakable. Each attempt ended the same way. The figures would find me, and I'd wake up again at 3:33 a.m. Determined to find the origin of the loop, I started searching the house for clues. In the attic, I discovered an old dusty journal that belonged to the previous owner. The entries spoke of dark rituals and a pact made at 3:33 a.m., the devil's hour. The last page contained a cryptic message. To break the cycle, one must face the shadows within. I realized that running and hiding wouldn't save me. Gathering all my courage, I decided to confront the shadowy figures. When they appeared, I stood my ground. "What do you want?" I shouted. The figures paused, and one stepped forward. In a voice that sounded like wind through the trees, it whispered, "You cannot escape what you refuse to acknowledge." I understood then that the shadows represented my own fears and regrets. I had been avoiding difficult truths in my life, hiding from problems rather than facing them. Summoning every ounce of strength, I admitted my faults aloud, accepting responsibility for my actions. The shadows began to fade, the darkness lifting. The next thing I knew, I was bathed in the soft glow of morning light. The clock read 7 a.m. The loop had been broken. From that day on, I embraced facing challenges head-on. The shadowy figures never returned, but the memory of those nights stayed with me, a haunting reminder of the traps we create for ourselves when we run from the truth. So if you ever find yourself awake at 3:33 a.m., take a moment to reflect. Sometimes, the scariest things aren't the shadows around us, but the ones within us. Story 4. I never imagined that taking a job as the night librarian at my university would lead me into a world of terror. It started out simple enough. I needed the extra money, and the library was always a peaceful place to study. My shift began at 11 p.m. and ended at 3 a.m. Easy, I thought. On my first night, the library was eerily quiet. Around midnight, I heard faint whispers coming from the old bookshelves in the back. I walked over, but no one was there, just rows of ancient books covered in dust. I shrugged it off as my imagination. The next night, the whispers grew louder. I noticed that some books were out of place, open on tables with pages filled with strange symbols I didn't recognize. A cold breeze brushed past me, even though all the windows were closed. By the third night, curiosity got the better of me. At exactly midnight, the lights flickered, and the atmosphere changed. The air felt heavy, and shadows danced between the aisles. I saw figures moving, but every time I tried to get a closer look, they vanished. I decided to follow the whispers. They led me to a hidden section of the library I had never seen before. The door was heavy, made of old wood with carvings that seemed to move as I looked at them. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with ancient artifacts and scrolls. Creatures with glowing eyes stared at me from the darkness. My heart pounded as I realized these weren't just stories. They were real. The library had become a gateway to other realms. Panicking, I tried to run, but the corridors twisted and turned, leading me deeper into this other world. The creatures began to follow me, their whispers turning into screams. Just when I thought I was trapped forever, I saw a faint light. I sprinted toward it and burst through a door, finding myself back in the main hall of the library. Everything was silent again. I grabbed my things and never looked back. I quit the next day. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that the gateway is still open, waiting for someone else to stumble upon it. Story 5. I arrived in the small town of Whispering Hollow on a chilly autumn afternoon. As a linguist fascinated by rare dialects, I was intrigued by reports of residents suddenly losing the ability to speak. The town was nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, giving it an isolated feel. Walking down Main Street, I noticed the silence immediately. Shops were open and people moved about, but there was no chatter, no laughter, just an eerie quiet. I approached a fruit vendor and tried to strike up a conversation. "Hello, I'm new in town. How are you today?" I asked. The vendor looked at me with wide eyes and opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He pointed to his throat and shook his head sadly. Confused, I went to the local diner, hoping to find someone who could speak. As I entered, the bell above the door jingled, but the patrons sat in silence, sipping their coffee and staring into space. A waitress approached me with a menu and a sympathetic smile. "Can you speak?" I whispered. She shook her head and pointed to a newspaper on the counter. The headline read, "Silence Falls Over Whispering Hollow." Feeling a chill run down my spine, I decided to visit the town hall. Maybe the mayor could explain what was happening. On my way, I noticed more unsettling things. Children sat on a playground swing without a sound. Dogs barked noiselessly. Even the wind seemed muted among the trees. At the town hall, I met Mayor Thompson. He gestured for me to sit and handed me a notebook. "Can you write what's happening here?" I asked. He scribbled quickly. "We are cursed. It started weeks ago." "How did it start?" I pressed. He wrote, "After the old oak tree was cut down." I recalled seeing a large stump in the town square. "Why was the tree cut down?" I asked. "To make room for a new statue," he wrote. Just then, a deafening scream filled my ears. I covered them, but it didn't help. Looking around, no one else seemed to react. "Did you hear that?" I exclaimed. The mayor gave me a puzzled look. Realizing that only I could hear the scream now, panic set in. I rushed out and headed to the town library, hoping to find any historical records. The librarian silently pointed me to the archives. Digging through old documents, I found a faded journal belonging to one of the town's founders, Abigail Moore. Her entries told a grim tale. The town was built on land sacred to an ancient tribe. The settlers had cut down a hallowed oak tree, ignoring the tribe's warning. A shaman cast a curse. When the silence returns, the voices of guilt will scream within. I connected the dots. The original tree had been a symbol of protection. Cutting down the new oak must have reactivated the curse. Determined to break it, I sought out the stump in the town square. As I approached, the scream in my ears grew louder. I knelt down and placed my hands on the stump. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "On behalf of the town, we seek forgiveness." A sudden wind whipped around me, and the leaves swirled in a frenzy. The deafening scream escalated, then abruptly stopped. A profound silence followed, and then sounds. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, distant chatter. People emerged from buildings, talking excitedly. Their voices filled the air, joyful and relieved. The mayor ran up to me, tears in his eyes. "You did it," he exclaimed. "We can speak again." I smiled, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. "Let's make sure we honor the past from now on." The town agreed to plant a new oak tree and hold an annual festival to respect the land's original guardians. As I left Whispering Hollow, the townsfolk waved and called out warm goodbyes. The nightmare was over, but the lesson remained. Sometimes the voices we ignore are the ones we most need to hear. Story 6. It was just another assignment. At least, that's what I told myself when my editor handed me the story. "People disappearing in a small town," he said, tossing a stack of notes onto my desk. "Nothing's been confirmed, but they want a report." I've been a journalist for over 10 years, chasing leads and piecing together stories that most people skim through while sipping their morning coffee. But this one felt different from the start. My name is Emily Carson, and the town I was sent to was called Ashwood. Barely a dot on the map, tucked away in the woods where the roads wind like veins through the trees. From what I could gather, people had been disappearing there for months. No bodies, no clues, just gone. I drove into Ashwood on a rainy afternoon. The town was as small as I expected. A few houses, a general store, and a gas station that looked like it hadn't seen a car in years. The trees loomed around the town, dark and thick, like they were hiding something. I pulled into a motel, the only one in town, and checked in. The place was run by a woman named Linda, who gave me a tired smile when I told her I was there for work. "Let me guess," she said, her voice soft but raspy. "You're here about the disappearances." I nodded, trying to hide my surprise. "What can you tell me?" Linda sighed and handed me the key to my room. "Not much. People just vanish. No signs, no struggle. It's like they step out of their lives and never come back." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I shook it off. "Any ideas about where they go?" She shrugged. "If I knew, I wouldn't still be here, would I?" I laughed nervously and took the key, but as I walked away, I could feel her eyes on me. There was something she wasn't saying, something she was afraid of. The room was small and smelled faintly of mildew, but it would do for the night. After unpacking, I decided to head into town to see if anyone would talk to me. It didn't take long to realize that most people were avoiding me, like they knew why I was there and didn't want to get involved. Finally, at the general store, I met an older man named Mr. Harlan. He was sitting outside, smoking a pipe, and when I introduced myself as a journalist, he didn't flinch. "Disappearances, huh?" he muttered, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "I'd stay out of it if I were you." "Why's that?" I asked. Sitting down next to him, he glanced at me, his eyes dark and serious. Because once you start looking, it looks back, I frowned. What do you mean? Mr. Harlan tapped his pipe against the edge of the chair. This town? There's something wrong with it. Always has been. People vanish, and it's like the town just swallows them up. No one talks about it. No one wants to, because deep down, we all know we're next. I didn't know what to say to that. The man clearly believed what he was saying, but it sounded like the kind of superstition you hear in every small town. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his words. I spent the next few days interviewing anyone who would talk to me, but no one gave me much. Everyone seemed scared, on edge, like they were waiting for something bad to happen. And the worst part? I felt it too. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. Then, on the third day, I met her. Her name was Clara. She was in her early 30s, pale and jittery, and she was the only one who seemed eager to talk. She had a story, she said. A story about her sister, who had disappeared a few months ago. We met at the diner. She sat across from me, wringing her hands as she spoke. It was like she was there 1 minute and gone the next, Clara said, her voice trembling. No signs, no clues, just gone. Did you notice anything strange before she disappeared? I asked, scribbling notes as fast as I could. Clara hesitated. She kept talking about dreams, strange ones. She said she could see another place, just beyond the trees, like there was something there, watching. I felt a chill creep up my spine. What kind of place? Clara's eyes darted around the diner before she leaned in closer. It wasn't a dream. I know that now. I've seen it too. My breath caught in my throat. What do you mean? Clara bit her lip, her eyes wide with fear. There's another world, a place that overlaps with ours. You can't see it most of the time anyway, but it's there. And if you get too close, it pulls you in. I stared at her, unsure whether to believe her or not. How do you know this? Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. Because I've been there. I followed my sister, and now I can't escape. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I leaned in closer, trying to keep my voice steady. What did you see? Clara's hands shook as she spoke. It's like our world, but wrong. Everything's twisted, dark. The people, they're not right. They're like shadows, wandering, lost. And once you're there, you're stuck. You can't get out. I didn't know what to say. It sounded impossible, like something out of a nightmare. But the look in her eyes, the fear, the desperation, it was real. Can you show me? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Clara hesitated, her eyes filled with dread. You don't want to see it, trust me. But I couldn't let it go. This was the story I had come for. Please, if there's any chance of finding your sister, I need to see it. Clara stared at me for a long moment before nodding. Meet me at the edge of the woods tonight. Midnight. I'll take you there. That night, I stood at the edge of the forest, my flashlight cutting through the thick fog that clung to the ground. Clara arrived shortly after, her face pale and drawn. Are you sure about this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. I need to know. Without another word, Clara led me into the woods. The trees loomed above us, their branches twisting and tangling like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder the deeper we went, and the silence was deafening. After what felt like hours, Clara stopped. We're here, she whispered, pointing ahead. I squinted into the darkness and saw it, an old, crumbling stone archway, barely visible in the thick fog. It looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries, hidden from the world. What is this? I asked, my voice trembling. Clara's eyes were wide with fear. It's the gateway. Once you pass through, you're not in our world anymore. I stared at the archway, my heart racing. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to run away, but I couldn't. I had to know the truth. Without thinking, I stepped forward, crossing under the archway. The moment I passed through, everything changed. The air was colder, the trees darker, and the ground beneath my feet felt wrong, like it was shifting beneath me. I turned to look at Clara, but she was gone. Panic surged through me. I called out her name, but the only response was the distant echo of my own voice. I was alone. I turned back toward the archway, but it wasn't there anymore. The forest stretched on in every direction, endless and suffocating. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, shifting and twisting like they were alive. I started walking, hoping to find my way back, but the deeper I went, the more I realized that I wasn't in Ashwood anymore. This place, it was something else. A place where the rules of reality didn't apply. As I walked, I began to see them, the lost people, or what was left of them, wandering through the trees. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow. They didn't see me, didn't acknowledge my presence. They were trapped, just like Clara had said. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. Was this my fate? To wander this twisted version of the world, lost and forgotten? I didn't want to believe it, but the longer I stayed, the more the truth sank in. There was no way out. I don't know how long I wandered through that twisted version of the forest. Time felt different here, like it was stretching, warping. Minutes felt like hours, hours felt like days. I tried to keep moving, but every path looked the same, every tree a shadowy, distorted reflection of the last. The cold was biting now, seeping into my bones. I had lost sight of the archway, and with it, any hope of finding my way back. The figures, the lost souls, drifted past me like wraiths, their eyes vacant, their mouths slack, as if they had long since given up trying to escape. I could almost hear them, whispering just on the edge of my perception. The sound was soft, like leaves rustling in a distant wind, but there were words hidden in that sound. I stopped, listening carefully, and realized they were saying the same thing over and over. Help me. Find me. Save me. Their voices wrapped around me like a fog, thick and heavy, pulling me deeper into this place, into the shadows. I couldn't think straight anymore. I was losing myself, just like them. That's when I saw the light. It was faint, flickering in the distance like a dying star, but it was real. I knew I had to reach it. I forced my legs to move, stumbling over roots and rocks, desperate for any sign of hope. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, cutting through the darkness. It wasn't like the cold, harsh light of a flashlight. It was warm, almost inviting. But something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this place. Finally, I reached the source of the light. It was coming from a small cabin, nestled in the trees. The cabin looked old, its wooden walls cracked and weathered, but there was something familiar about it. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt like I had seen it before. The door was slightly ajar, and the light spilled out into the clearing, casting long shadows across the ground. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was small, just one room with a few pieces of old furniture scattered around. A fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. At first glance, it looked like a normal, if abandoned cabin. But then I saw it. A large, ornate mirror stood against the far wall. It was out of place, too elegant for such a rustic cabin. The frame was made of dark, twisted metal, and the glass itself seemed to shimmer, reflecting the room in a way that made it seem wrong, like the reflection was almost alive. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The mirror drew me in, like it was calling to me. I could see my reflection staring back at me, but something wasn't right. The woman in the mirror looked like me, but her eyes were wrong, darker, emptier. I froze, unable to look away. The reflection tilted its head just slightly and then it smiled. But it wasn't a smile of warmth or comfort. It was cold, cruel, like it knew something I didn't. Then, without warning, the reflection moved. Not a small movement, not a twitch. It moved toward me, stepping out of the mirror like it was crossing through water. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This can't be real." But it was. The figure, my reflection, was standing in front of me now, grinning. It looked just like me, but it wasn't me. I could feel the difference, the darkness that clung to it like a shadow. "What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The reflection tilted its head again, the smile never leaving its face. "I am you," it said, its voice a distorted echo of my own, "or I will be." Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but the door slammed shut on its own. The cabin felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in, trapping me inside. I backed away, my eyes darting around for any escape, but there was none. The reflection, my reflection, took a step closer, its smile growing wider, more twisted. "You can't run," it whispered. "You're already part of this place." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "No, I'm getting out of here." The reflection laughed, a low, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. There's no way out, Emily. There never was. Once you see the other side, it sees you too, and it wants you. I felt the air grow colder, the darkness pressing in around me. The reflection raised its hand, reaching out toward me. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pulling me in, like it was trying to merge with me, to take my place. I had to do something. Anything. My eyes landed on the mirror. It had started all of this. If I could just destroy it? Without thinking, I grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and swung it at the mirror with all my strength. The glass shattered, exploding into 1,000 tiny shards. For a moment, everything went silent, the world itself seeming to hold its breath. Then the cabin began to shake. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and the air was filled with a low, eerie hum. The reflection let out a piercing scream, a sound that made my blood run cold, and then it was gone. Vanished, like smoke in the wind. I stumbled back, breathing hard, my heart racing. The cabin had stopped shaking, and the darkness that had pressed in on me was gone. But so was the door. I was trapped. Panic surged through me. I ran to the spot where the door had been, but there was nothing, just a solid wall of wood. I pounded on it, screamed for help, but no one answered. And then, slowly, I realized the truth. The mirror hadn't been a way out. It had been a way in, a gateway into this twisted version of the world. And now that I had destroyed it, there was no escape. I was stuck here. Forever. The next few days, weeks, months, I couldn't tell anymore, were a blur. I wandered through the empty cabin, through the endless forest outside, but there was no way out. The lost souls still wandered, but they didn't see me anymore. I was one of them now. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something in the distance, a flicker of light, a shadow moving through the trees, but it was never real. Just illusions, tricks of this place, designed to keep me here. And the worst part? I knew I wasn't alone. I could still feel the reflection. It was always there, just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down, waiting to take what was left of me. So here I am, trapped in a place that isn't quite real, but isn't quite a nightmare either. Just nothing. If you're reading this, if somehow my story has made it out, please stay away from Ashwood. Stay away from the forest, and whatever you do, don't look too closely, because if you do, it'll look back. And once it sees you, you're already gone. Story 7. It started on a Thursday. My husband, Mike, and I had just moved into a new house, a cute little place on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it was perfect for us. We were excited to finally have a home of our own, a place where we could settle down and start thinking about the future. The house was old, though, and it had its quirks. Creaky floorboards, drafty windows, the usual stuff you expect from an old building. But it had charm, and that made it feel cozy. We spent the first few days unpacking, getting things organized, and settling in. Everything was normal, or at least, it seemed that way, until we found the door. It was in the hallway, just outside the guest bedroom. A small, plain, wooden door, painted the same off-white as the rest of the walls. The weird thing was, we hadn't noticed it when we first moved in. I swear it wasn't there when we toured the house. Mike said the same thing. Do you remember seeing this door before? I asked, running my hand over the cool surface. It was smooth, too smooth, like it hadn't aged along with the rest of the house. Mike frowned, staring at the door like it was something out of place. No, I don't think I did, but it's probably just a storage closet. You know how old houses are, full of hidden spaces. It made sense. The house was old, and we hadn't done a full inspection of every nook and cranny. Still, something about the door bothered me. It looked too new, like it didn't belong, but we didn't think much of it at the time. We had more important things to worry about, like unpacking boxes and figuring out where the heck the Wi-Fi router was. That night, after we'd finally settled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing down the hallway at the door. It was closed, but I couldn't help but feel like it was waiting. Are you okay? Mike asked, turning off the bedside lamp. His voice was muffled by sleep. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Just tired, I guess. But I wasn't tired. Not really. Something about that door kept nagging at me, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the house settle around us. Every creak and groan made me more anxious, but eventually I fell asleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Sunlight poured through the windows, filling the house with warmth. The door looked harmless in the daylight, just a simple wooden door like any other. Mike was already up, making coffee in the kitchen. I joined him, feeling silly for letting my imagination get the better of me. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, handing me a mug. I nodded, taking a sip. "Yeah, I'm fine. I don't know. That door kind of creeps me out." Mike chuckled, shaking his head. "It's just a door, Sarah. I'm sure it leads to a closet or something. We'll check it out later." He was right. It was just a door. But that didn't stop the uneasy feeling from creeping back in as the day went on. We spent the rest of the day running errands and finishing up the last of the unpacking. The door was forgotten, until that night. I woke up to the sound of creaking. At first, I thought it was the house settling again, but this was different. It was rhythmic, like something was moving. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Mike was asleep beside me, snoring softly. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak, like someone, or something, was opening the door. I held my breath, listening. The sound was coming from the hallway, from the direction of the strange door. I slid out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor. I didn't want to wake Mike. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe the door had come loose somehow. But as I stepped into the hallway, the air grew colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The door was open. Just a crack, but it was enough to send a wave of fear through me. I hadn't opened it, neither had Mike. And yet, there it was, slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. I took a shaky step forward, my pulse racing in my ears. I reached out, pushing the door open slowly. Beyond it was nothing, just darkness. A deep black void that seemed to swallow the light from the hallway. It wasn't a closet, and it definitely wasn't a normal room. It was as if the doorway led to another place entirely, a place where light didn't exist. I stood there, frozen, staring into the blackness. I couldn't see anything beyond the threshold, not even the floor or walls. It was like staring into the void. And then, something moved. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of motion in the dark. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, shadows shifting, writhing like they were alive. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe. What the hell had I just seen? I stood there for a moment, my back pressed against the door, trying to calm down. There was no way I had just seen that. It had to be a trick of the light. Maybe I was still half asleep. But the fear was real. The cold sweat on my skin was real. I rushed back to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, my mind racing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when the morning light finally crept through the curtains, I felt a strange sense of relief, like the darkness couldn't touch me during the day. I didn't mention the door to Mike. I didn't want him to think I was losing it. But that next night, the same thing happened. Creaking. Slow, deliberate. The door opening again, revealing the same inky black void. This time, I didn't go near it. I stayed in bed, pretending to be asleep, hoping that whatever was behind that door would stay in the dark. But the door continued to creak open, night after night. Each time, I felt like it was opening wider, like the darkness was spreading, reaching out into the hallway. The air grew colder every night, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker. Finally, after nearly a week of sleepless nights, I told Mike. He laughed at first, shaking his head like it was all just some kind of joke. But when I dragged him into the hallway and showed him the door, his smile faded. "It's just a closet," he said, but there was doubt in his voice. "Open it," I said, my heart pounding. Mike hesitated, but eventually he reached for the handle and pulled the door open. Nothing, just darkness. He frowned, stepping closer. "That's weird. I thought there'd be shelves or something in here." He grabbed a flashlight from the hall table and shined it into the space. But the light didn't penetrate the darkness. It just stopped, like the darkness was absorbing it. "Okay, that's not normal," Mike said, stepping back. I could tell he was trying to stay calm, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. We closed the door, but from that night on, neither of us could ignore it. The door became a part of our lives, an ever-present source of fear and dread. It would creak open every night, and no matter what we did, lock it, barricade it, it would still open, revealing that same endless void. We tried to ignore it, tried to act like everything was normal, but the darkness seemed to grow stronger with each passing night. We stopped sleeping. The house grew colder, the air thicker, and the worst part, we started hearing things. Voices. Faint, whispering voices coming from beyond the door. They were too quiet to understand, but they were there, always just on the edge of hearing, like they were calling to us, begging us to open the door and step into the dark. Mike and I were both on edge, snapping at each other over little things, unable to escape the oppressive feeling that something terrible was going to happen. And then, one night, it did. Story 8. I had just moved into a small apartment off campus. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood, perfect for studying and having friends over now and then. At first, everything was great, but soon after, things started getting weird. It was little stuff at first. You know that feeling when you're sure you left something in one spot, but when you come back, it's somewhere else? I chalked it up to stress. College life can be overwhelming, right? Late nights, long study sessions, it messes with your head. One night, I came home from the library hungry and tired. I went straight to the kitchen to heat up some leftovers, but when I opened the fridge, half of my food was missing. At first, I thought maybe I ate it earlier and just forgot. I mean, it happens, right? But this kept happening. Every couple of days, more food would go missing. I even asked my roommate Mike if he'd been sneaking snacks. He just laughed and said, "Dude, I've got my own food." That didn't really make sense, but I didn't think much of it. I was busy with school, and the last thing I needed was another mystery on my plate. After the food thing, I started noticing other oddities. A book I had left on the coffee table would be on the floor when I came back. My bed looked like someone had been sitting on it, even though I hadn't been in my room all day. Still, I shrugged it off. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I just didn't remember things as clearly as I thought I did. But then something happened that made it impossible to ignore. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I decided to spend the day cleaning my apartment. As I was vacuuming in my bedroom, I noticed the closet door was slightly open. Now, I'm pretty organized, and I always close my closet after grabbing something. I figured maybe Mike had borrowed something and forgot to close it. But when I pulled the door fully open, there was a strange smell, like sweat mixed with something old and damp. I looked around but didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just my clothes hanging up and a couple of boxes stacked on the floor. Still, that smell stuck with me. It was off. At this point, I knew something was wrong. I wasn't losing things, I wasn't being forgetful. Someone had been in my room, but who and how? Mike was a good guy, and I trusted him. He was out most of the time anyway, working late shifts at a nearby restaurant. I didn't want to accuse him of anything, and frankly, it didn't make sense for him to mess with my stuff when he had his own space. So I decided to set up a little experiment. I ordered a couple of cheap security cameras online. Nothing fancy, just small ones that I could hide in the living room, kitchen, and my bedroom. I figured if someone was sneaking in, I'd catch them on camera. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. I would check the footage each night before bed, hoping to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But the cameras showed exactly what I expected. Nothing. Just an empty apartment. Until one night, it was around midnight, and I had just finished a study session for my finals. Exhausted, I climbed into bed and fell asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. You know that gut feeling when you just know something's wrong? That's what I felt. I pulled out my phone to check the camera footage. I watched the first couple of hours, nothing. Just me sitting on the couch, watching TV, and eventually heading to bed. But then, at around 2 a.m., I saw it. In the footage from the camera in my bedroom, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow in the corner of the room. I squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Then the shadow moved again, and my heart nearly stopped. A figure, slow, deliberate, stepped out from my closet. They were moving carefully, like they didn't want to wake me. The person was hunched over, wearing dark, baggy clothes. They had long, tangled hair that covered most of their face, and they crept toward the foot of my bed. Just watching the footage, my hands were shaking. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Someone had been living in my apartment, in my closet, and I had no idea. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? knowing that someone had been in my room while I slept just feet away. The next day, I skipped my classes and stayed home. I was terrified, but determined to find out who this person was and how they had gotten into my apartment. I replayed the footage over and over again, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't see the person's face clearly, but they didn't seem aggressive. Still, the thought of someone sneaking around my apartment, my space, made my skin crawl. That night, I stayed awake, pretending to sleep. My plan was simple. I'd wait for them to come out, then confront them. My heart raced as the hours ticked by. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m. nothing. 2 a.m. still nothing. I was just about to give up when I heard it. A soft creak from the closet door. My muscles tensed as I listened to the quiet rustle of movement. Slowly, ever so slowly, I heard footsteps on the carpet. Without thinking, I jumped out of bed, flipping on the lights. "Who are you?" I shouted. The figure froze in the middle of my room. It was a woman, thin and disheveled, her eyes wide with fear. She raised her hands in a defensive posture, as if expecting me to attack. Her clothes were filthy, and she smelled like she hadn't bathed in weeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Please, don't hurt me." It took a while for both of us to calm down enough to talk. Her name was Claire. She wasn't some crazed murderer or criminal. She had been homeless for a while, struggling to survive after losing her job. Desperation had driven her to sneak into my apartment one night when I had left the window open. She found my closet and started living there, surviving on the food I had in the fridge and trying not to get caught. She didn't mean any harm. She was just scared and alone. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call the cops, but looking at her, this broken, scared woman, I just couldn't. We talked for a while. She told me how she ended up in this situation, how she had tried shelters but they were full, and how she had been too ashamed to ask for help. After that night, I couldn't let her stay in my apartment, but I also couldn't turn my back on her. I ended up helping her get in touch with a local shelter, and eventually, she got some support to get back on her feet. But the experience changed me. Knowing that someone had been living in my home without me knowing for weeks, it was terrifying. I had always thought of my apartment as a safe place, but now every creak, every shadow made me jump. I moved out of that apartment not long after. Even now, in my new place, I still find myself checking closets before bed. The thought that someone could be watching you, living right under your nose, is something I'll never shake. Story 9. My name is Ryan, and I'm from Maplebrook, a quiet, friendly town nestled between miles of dense forest. Maplebrook was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. I'd lived there my whole life, and I knew every street, every face, every little nook and cranny, or at least I thought I did. Until last summer. That's when the posters started showing up. At first, it wasn't too unusual. People go missing sometimes, right? They get lost or have an accident, or sometimes they just want to leave. It was sad, of course, but not unheard of. The first person to disappear was Mr. Jenkins, an older man who lived by himself near the edge of town. He was quiet, always kept to himself, so it wasn't immediately clear that something was wrong. He'd go off camping for days at a time. But after a week or so, people started to worry. Then came the poster. Missing. His face, tired and worn, plastered all over town. It wasn't long before another poster went up, and another, and another. But here's the weird thing. After a couple of days, Mr. Jenkins came back. I was grabbing groceries at the local store when I overheard a couple of people talking about it. "He just showed up like nothing happened," one lady said. "Doesn't even remember being gone." That piqued my interest. Didn't remember? What kind of person goes missing for days and just forgets? Then it happened again, and again. One by one, people in our town would disappear for days at a time, only to come back with no memory of where they'd been, no idea why they were gone. They'd wake up in their beds as if nothing had happened at all. The only thing they all had in common were the marks. They called them the forgotten marks. I never thought it would happen to me. I didn't have the time to think about disappearing. I was 17 with plans to leave Maplebrook after graduation to get away from this small town life. But one evening, it was like something shifted. I was walking home after hanging out with some friends. We'd been up late, playing video games and messing around like we always did on weekends. I took the long way home, cutting through the park like I usually did. The sun had set, and the air was starting to cool, but something felt off. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like the town wasn't right. The trees were too still, and the wind, it was silent. Dead silent. No crickets chirping, no rustling leaves, just me and the gravel crunching under my feet. I quickened my pace, thinking I'd just spooked myself, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. They were heavy, dragging footsteps coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there, just the empty street and the dim glow of the streetlights. My heart was racing now. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I turned around and started walking faster, practically jogging at this point, when suddenly I felt a sharp pain at the back of my neck. Then, nothing. When I woke up, it was dark. Not the kind of dark you get in the middle of the night, where you can still see the faint glow of moonlight. No, this was complete darkness. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. My head was throbbing, and I felt groggy, like I'd been asleep for days. I didn't know where I was, or how I'd gotten there. I stood up, trying to get my bearings. The ground was cold and hard beneath my feet, and the air was thick, damp. There was a strange smell, moldy, like the inside of an old basement. I reached out in the darkness, my hand brushing against something cold and metallic. Bars. I was in some kind of cage. Panic hit me like a freight train. "Help," I shouted, banging on the bars. "Someone help me." There was no answer, no sound at all, just silence. I don't know how long I was there, but eventually I must have passed out again. The next thing I remember is waking up in my own bed. At first, I thought it had been a nightmare, a vivid, awful dream. But then I looked at my phone. I'd been gone for 4 days. The forgotten marks. My parents were frantic when they saw me. They said I'd just vanished. They'd searched everywhere, called the police, but there were no signs of me anywhere. When I asked where they found me, they looked confused. They hadn't. I just appeared in my room, as if nothing had happened. I didn't tell them about the cage. I didn't tell anyone. But something had happened. I knew it wasn't just a dream. When I looked in the mirror, I saw them. The marks. 3 thin, red lines etched into the skin on the back of my neck, like scratches, but perfectly parallel. I felt sick just looking at them. I wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, I started noticing more people with marks just like mine. They tried to cover them up with scarves or high collars, but I knew. And the weirdest part? They wouldn't talk about it. If you asked them about their disappearance, they'd just get this distant look in their eyes and change the subject. It was like they couldn't remember or didn't want to. But I remembered. After I came back, things didn't feel right. It was like the town had changed. Or maybe it was me. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of people standing at the edge of the forest, their eyes following me as I walked by. And the footsteps, those heavy, dragging footsteps, they never stopped. One night, a week after I came back, I woke up to the sound of someone whispering. It was faint, but I could hear it. A soft, breathy voice saying my name over and over. "Ryan, Ryan." My heart was pounding in my chest, and I sat up, looking around my room. The whispering stopped, but the air was heavy, thick with tension. And then I saw it. Standing in the corner of my room, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. Tall, thin, with long, bony arms. Its head was tilted to one side, as if it was listening. I froze, my blood running cold. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure just stood there, watching me. And then, slowly, it raised one long finger to its lips. Shh. The next thing I remember is waking up the next morning, drenched in sweat. The figure was gone, but the whispering, it stayed. I wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, I started talking to other people who had disappeared. At first, it was hard to get them to open up. They'd look at me like I was crazy, telling me they didn't remember anything. But eventually, a few of them started to crack. Little bits and pieces of memories would slip through, like flashes of something too terrible to fully recall. One girl, Sophie, told me she remembered being in a forest, surrounded by shadows. They were watching me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't see their faces, but I knew they were there. They wanted something from me. Another guy, Max, said he remembered hearing voices, hundreds of voices, all whispering his name at once. It was like they were inside my head, he said, rubbing the back of his neck where the marks were. They didn't want me to leave. And then there was Luke. Luke was the last person to disappear before me, and when he came back, he was different, quieter, more withdrawn. He'd always been the life of the party, the guy everyone wanted to be around, but after his disappearance, he barely spoke to anyone. One night, I cornered him at the diner and asked him what had happened. At first, he didn't say anything, just stared at me with this blank, haunted expression. But finally, he spoke. "They're not done with us," he whispered. "We didn't come back alone." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. Something had followed me back. It was watching me, waiting. The last night I spent in Maplebrook was the worst of my life. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard the whispering again. It was louder this time, more urgent. "Ryan, Ryan, come back." I sat up, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. The figure. Standing. Story 10. My name's Sarah, and I live with my mom, dad, and my little brother Jake. We had just moved into this new house after my dad got a promotion. It was a huge, old Victorian-style house, the kind you see in movies, complete with creaky wooden floors, long, dark hallways, and an attic that hadn't been touched in years. I thought it was kind of cool at first, but I had no idea what we were really getting into. It all started with that doll. Moving day was hectic, like any move is. Boxes everywhere, furniture being dragged up the stairs, and my mom trying to make sure nothing got scratched. My dad was excited about the place, talking about how much room we'd have and how it was such a good deal. Looking back, it was too good of a deal, but we were just happy to have the space. Jake and I were assigned to our rooms on the second floor. His room was right across from mine, and he couldn't wait to get his video game set up. Everything seemed normal at first. We were just getting used to the creaky sounds the house made at night. That's what happens in old houses, right? They make noises. The first night was quiet. We were all exhausted, so we fell asleep almost immediately. But the next day, that's when we found it. The doll. It was Jake who found it. He had been exploring the attic while my parents were busy unpacking downstairs. I was in my room, setting up my bed, when I heard Jake call out from above me, "Hey Sarah, you gotta see this!" I climbed up to the attic, and there he was, standing in the middle of the dusty room, holding this old doll. It was creepy, to say the least. The doll was about 2 feet tall, with a porcelain face, glassy blue eyes, and long brown hair. Its dress was old-fashioned, pale blue with lace around the edges, and it had little black shoes. I remember looking at it and immediately getting this weird feeling in my stomach. "Put that thing back, Jake," I told him. "It's creepy." But Jake, being the annoying little brother he is, just laughed. "It's just a doll, Sarah. You're such a baby." He took it downstairs to show Mom and Dad, and of course they didn't care. "It's probably been up there for years," Dad said, not even looking up from the box he was unpacking. "It's just an old toy." I wanted nothing to do with it, but Jake decided to keep it in his room. "She's gonna be my new friend," he said, placing the doll on a shelf near his bed. For the first couple of days, everything was fine. The doll just sat there, staring out with its creepy little eyes. I tried to ignore it whenever I was in Jake's room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were always watching, even when I wasn't looking. Then, things started getting weird. It was small stuff at first. I'd be walking down the hallway, and I'd swear I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, like a shadow darting behind a door. Or I'd go into Jake's room, and the doll would be sitting in a different position. One day, I found it lying on the floor in the hallway. "Jake," I said, holding the doll up in front of him, "you left your creepy doll in the hallway again." Jake just looked at me, confused. "I didn't move it," he said. "It was on my shelf when I left for school." I didn't believe him, of course. I mean, come on. Who else could have moved it? But then it happened again, and again. The doll would appear in different places around the house, sometimes on the couch, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes even outside on the porch. Each time, Jake swore he hadn't moved it. That's when I started to get freaked out. A couple of weeks passed and things only got stranger. One night, I was in my room doing homework when I heard my mom call from downstairs. "Sarah, can you come help me with dinner?" I sighed, putting down my pencil, and went down the stairs. But when I got to the kitchen, my mom wasn't there. "Mom?" I called out, but there was no answer. Confused, I walked through the house, checking the living room and the back porch, but I couldn't find her anywhere. I finally went upstairs to her bedroom, and there she was, sitting on the bed, reading a book. "Mom, why did you ask me to come help you with dinner if you're just sitting here?" I asked. She looked at me, confused. "Sarah, I didn't say anything. I've been up here for the past hour." My heart skipped a beat. I knew I'd heard her voice. I wasn't imagining it. But if she didn't call me, then who did? That wasn't the last time it happened. A few days later, I was in the backyard when I heard Jake's voice call out from the house. "Sarah, come quick. I need help." I ran inside, thinking something was wrong, but Jake wasn't there. I finally found him in his room, playing his video games. "Jake, what's going on? I heard you calling me." He paused the game and looked at me like I was crazy. I didn't say anything. It was then that I noticed the doll. It was sitting on the shelf behind him, staring at me with those glassy blue eyes, almost like it was mocking me. The mimicry got worse. My dad heard my voice calling from the attic one night, but I was in my room the whole time. Mom heard Jake's voice when he wasn't even home. We all started hearing voices, calling to us, luring us to different parts of the house. The worst part was, it was always someone we knew. Someone we trusted. And every time we'd go to check, the doll would be there, just sitting, just watching. We started locking it in a box in the basement, hoping that would stop it, but no matter what we did, the doll always came back. We'd find it in random places around the house, and it would start all over again, the voices, the movements, the eerie feeling of being watched. One night, it almost lured Jake into real danger. I'll never forget that night. It was late, probably around midnight, and I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. That's when I heard it. Jake's voice, calling from outside my window. "Sarah, come help me." I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and ran to the window. But when I looked out, I didn't see Jake. All I saw was the backyard, dark and empty. Something in my gut told me to check his room. I threw open his door, and there he was, sound asleep in bed. But then I heard the voice again from outside. "Sarah, please." My blood ran cold. That was Jake's voice, but Jake was right here, fast asleep. I knew something wasn't right. I slowly walked to his window and looked out, and that's when I saw it, the doll. It was sitting on the grass in the middle of the backyard, staring up at me, with its tiny porcelain hands raised toward the window. I slammed the window shut and locked it, backing away as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, and my heart felt like it was going to pound out of my chest. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a doll. It was something else, something that wanted to hurt us. The next morning, I told my parents everything. I told them about the voices, the doll's movements, and how I'd seen it outside the window. At first, they didn't believe me, but then I showed them the doll in the backyard, exactly where I'd seen it the night before. That was the final straw for my dad. He grabbed the doll, threw it in a garbage bag, and drove it to the dump. We thought that would be the end of it. We thought getting rid of the doll would make everything go back to normal. But we were wrong. A week after we got rid of the doll, we were sitting at the dinner table, enjoying a quiet meal, when we heard a loud bang from upstairs. My dad looked at me and Jake, assuming we'd left something lying around, but we hadn't. He went upstairs to check, and when he came back down, his face was pale. In his hand, he held the doll. It was back. We didn't know what to do. My dad was convinced someone was playing a prank on us, but deep down, I knew the truth. The doll wasn't just a toy. It was something. Story 11. My name is Matt, and I'm about to tell you the story of a childhood friend I didn't remember. A friend who came back into my life in a way that still haunts me. It started with a simple text message, but what followed was something I'll never forget. It was a normal Tuesday. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, when I got a text message from an unknown number. The message read, "Hey Matt, it's me, Ben. Do you remember me?" I stared at my phone, completely confused. Ben? The name didn't ring any bells. I racked my brain, trying to think of anyone I knew named Ben. Nothing. I shrugged it off. Probably a wrong number or some kind of prank. I didn't think much of it and went about my day. But later that night, I got another message. "Matt, it's Ben. We used to be best friends when we were kids. Don't you remember?" This time it gave me pause. Best friends? I was sure I didn't know anyone named Ben. I decided to respond, figuring I'd just clear up the confusion. Sorry, I think you've got the wrong person. I don't remember a Ben. I hit send and waited. A few minutes later, another message came through. No, Matt, I'm not mistaken. We were best friends. We did everything together. We made promises. How can you forget me? The message was unsettling, to say the least. Something about the way it was written sent a shiver down my spine. I had no memory of this person, no recollection of any promises. But the desperation in the message was undeniable. The next day I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was this Ben? Why didn't I remember him? I decided to ask my parents, just to see if they had any idea who he could be. At dinner, I casually brought it up. Hey, did I ever have a friend named Ben when I was little? My mom looked at me, surprised. Ben? I don't think so. Why? I got these weird messages from someone claiming to be my childhood friend, I explained. But I don't remember him at all. My dad chimed in. You had a lot of friends when you were younger, but no one named Ben comes to mind. Maybe it's just someone messing with you. I nodded, trying to shake the unease I was feeling. Maybe it was just a prank, like they said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. That night, I got another message. You promised you wouldn't forget me. How could you break our promise, Matt? The words sent a chill down my spine. What promise? What was this person talking about? I didn't reply. I couldn't. Something about the whole situation was starting to feel wrong. And that's when the dreams started. The first dream was hazy. I was in a park, a familiar place from my childhood, running around and laughing. But I wasn't alone. There was another boy with me. We were playing tag, running through the trees, and I could hear his laughter, but his face was blurry, like I couldn't quite see him. When I woke up, I felt disoriented. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, but I still couldn't remember who the boy was. Was it Ben? Over the next few nights, the dreams kept coming. Each one was a little clearer, and each time, the boy in the dream seemed a little more familiar. We played games, told stories, and built forts in the woods behind my childhood home. I could hear his voice, see his clothes, but his face, it was always just out of focus. And every morning, I woke up feeling more uneasy. The messages didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Matt, why are you ignoring me? Don't you remember the things we did together? The secrets we shared? You promised you'd never forget me, you swore. I started to feel like I was being haunted. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would skip a beat. I'd find myself checking my surroundings, making sure I was alone, even when I knew I was. One night, I decided to confront him. I needed answers. I typed out a message, my fingers trembling. What are you talking about? What promise? Who are you really? The response came almost immediately. You don't remember, do you? It's because of what happened. You forgot everything after that day. That stopped me cold. After what day? I didn't know what he meant. What could have happened that made me forget? I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know the truth. I spent the next few days digging through old photos, trying to piece together my childhood. I went through boxes of old pictures, yearbooks, anything I could find. But there was no trace of anyone named Ben. Then, one evening, while I was flipping through an old photo album, I found something strange. It was a picture of me and a group of kids from when I was about 7 years old. We were all smiling, standing in front of a playground. But there was something off about the photo. In the far corner, there was a boy standing slightly apart from the rest of us. His face was blurred, like the camera hadn't focused on him properly. I stared at the picture, my heart racing. Was that Ben? I showed the photo to my mom, but she just shook her head. That's strange. I don't remember that boy at all. He must have been a friend from school or something. I wasn't so sure. The boy in the picture. It didn't feel right. It felt wrong. Like he didn't belong there. Like he was a shadow, a memory that shouldn't have been captured. The messages from Ben continued, but now they had a darker tone. You've forgotten the most important thing, Matt. The thing that happened that day. I tried to warn you, but you didn't listen. You need to remember. Please, it's the only way. I'm still waiting for you. By this point, I was terrified. The dreams, the messages, the blurry figure in the photo, it was all connected, but I didn't know how. I felt like I was going crazy, like my mind was unraveling. And then I got the last message. The one that changed everything. Do you remember the woods behind your house? Meet me there. You'll understand once you're there. The woods. I hadn't been back there in years. Not since... I didn't know. Something about those woods felt wrong. Like there was something buried there in my memories that I didn't want to face. But I had to go. I had to know the truth. I waited until dusk when the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the ground. The woods behind my childhood home were dense, filled with towering trees and thick underbrush. As I made my way through the familiar path, I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me. The air was heavy, and the further I walked, the more I felt like I was walking into a memory. The trees loomed above me, their branches twisting in the wind like reaching hands. The sound of leaves crunching under my feet was the only noise, and it echoed in the quiet. I reached a small clearing, a place I hadn't seen in years, and that's when the memories came flooding back. Ben, we had been playing in these woods, just the two of us. Best friends, like he said. We'd come out here all the time to explore, to play games, to make up stories about monsters and ghosts. But one day something had gone wrong. We'd ventured too far, deeper into the woods than we ever had before. And that's when we found it, a deep pit, hidden beneath a pile of leaves. I remember standing on the edge, looking down into the darkness, and feeling a sense of dread. Ben had fallen. I couldn't save him. That was the day I lost Ben. He had fallen into the pit, and I had run home, too scared to tell anyone what had happened. Too scared to admit that I had let my friend die. The memory had been buried deep, locked away in the corners of my mind, but now it was all coming back. The messages, the dreams, the blurry figure in the photo, it was all Ben, trying to reach me, trying to remind me of the promise we made. The promise that I wouldn't forget him. I stood at the edge of the pit, staring down into the darkness. "I'm sorry, Ben," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, carried on the wind. "I forgive you." After that night, the messages stopped. The dreams faded, and the strange unease that had followed me for weeks disappeared. I finally remembered what had happened, and I finally let go of the guilt I had been carrying for so long. But even now, I still think about Ben. I still wonder if he's out there, somewhere, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I can almost hear his voice, faint and distant, calling my name from the woods. "Matt, don't forget me again." Some memories are too painful to face, and some promises are too important to break. I learned that the hard way. I don't know if Ben was ever really gone, or if he was just a figment of my guilty conscience, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget him again. And if you ever get a message from someone you don't remember, someone from your past, be careful. They might be waiting for you, just like Ben was waiting for me. Story 12. My name is Jason, and this is a story about something my friends and I went through about 2 summers ago. It was supposed to be just another weekend of camping and hanging out, something we'd done 1,000 times before, but this time was different. This time, we found the house. It was me, my best friend Ethan, his girlfriend Jess, and her younger brother Mike. We'd all grown up together in the same small town. We'd been through a lot, summers spent biking through back roads, winters playing video games at each other's houses. But this camping trip was supposed to be special. It was right before college, our last summer together, before we all went our separate ways. We set out on a Friday afternoon, loaded up with camping gear, food, and a cooler full of snacks. Our plan was to camp out in Black Hollow Woods, a place we'd been dozens of times. The woods were thick and quiet, the kind of place that makes you feel like the rest of the world doesn't exist. We knew them well, or so we thought. By the time we arrived and set up camp, the sun was beginning to set. We lit a fire, roasted some marshmallows, and joked around like we always did. It was shaping up to be a perfect night. That's when Mike brought up the house. "I heard there's this old mansion deep in the woods," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "My buddy said he saw it once, but only at night. Apparently it's supposed to be haunted or something." Jess rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, Mike, you always believe the dumbest stuff." But Ethan perked up. "A haunted mansion? In Black Hollow? I've never heard of that." I hadn't either, and that's what made it kind of intriguing. We all loved scary stuff. Haunted houses, ghost stories, urban legends. It was our thing. So the idea of a mysterious mansion hidden in the woods? Yeah, it definitely grabbed our attention. I say we go look for it, Ethan suggested, standing up and dusting off his jeans. If it's haunted, even better. It's not like we're doing anything else. I wasn't entirely sure. I mean, we were in the middle of the woods, it was getting dark, and the last thing we needed was to get lost. But Ethan had this way of making things sound fun, like no matter what, everything would be fine. So against my better judgment, we grabbed our flashlights and set off into the woods, leaving the warmth of the fire behind. We'd been walking for about an hour. The deeper we went, the darker it got. Our flashlights barely pierced the shadows, and the trees seemed to close in on us. The air was thick, almost too quiet, like even the birds and insects had gone to sleep. I remember feeling uneasy, like we were being watched, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the adventure. Then, out of nowhere, Mike stopped dead in his tracks. "Look," he whispered, pointing ahead. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, as I squinted through the trees, I saw it. A large, shadowy shape in the distance. A house. Not just any house, though. This place was massive. Way too big to be hidden out here in the woods. It was dark, with tall, pointed roofs and ornate, ivy-covered walls. The moonlight barely touched it, making it look like something straight out of a nightmare. "That wasn't here during the day," Jess said quietly, and I could hear the nervousness in her voice. She was right. We'd been through this part of the woods earlier that afternoon, and there was no mansion, no structure of any kind. "I told you," Mike whispered excitedly. "It only shows up at night." We all stood there, staring at it, unsure of what to do. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to turn back, to go back to the safety of our camp, but another part, probably the stupid part, wanted to go in. I mean, how often do you get the chance to explore a haunted mansion in the middle of the woods? Ethan, being Ethan, was the first to move. "Come on," he said, grinning. "Let's check it out. What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words, right? The front door was old and heavy, creaking loudly as Ethan pushed it open. Inside, it was even darker than outside. Our flashlights barely lit up the hallway in front of us, but what we could see was enough to make my skin crawl. The place was huge, like a labyrinth of rooms and corridors, with high ceilings and grand staircases. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung from the corners like old, forgotten decorations. "Whoa," Mike breathed. "This place is crazy." I couldn't argue with that. The house was beautiful in a way, if you ignored the eerie atmosphere and the feeling that something was very, very wrong. We started exploring, sticking close together as we moved from room to room. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets, like someone had left in a hurry and never returned. But the deeper we went, the stranger things became. At first, it was small stuff. We'd turn a corner and end up in a room that didn't seem to belong. One minute we'd be in what looked like a grand ballroom, and the next we'd be in a narrow hallway with doors that led to nowhere. "This doesn't make any sense," Jess whispered. "Houses don't just change like this." But they did. Every time we turned around, the layout was different. The rooms were shifting. One minute, the stairs would lead up, and the next, they'd go down. It was like the house was alive, like it was playing with us. "I don't like this," I finally said, my voice trembling. "We should leave." But Ethan, stubborn as ever, wasn't ready to give up. "Come on, we just got here. There's got to be more to see." That's when we heard it. A faint noise like footsteps, but they weren't ours. We all froze, our flashlights shaking in our hands. "Did you hear that?" Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. We stood there in silence, listening. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the room we were in. My heart was racing. I could feel the fear rising in my throat, but none of us dared to move. Then, slowly, the door to the room creaked open. I don't know what I was expecting, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. The door swung open, and there was no one there. Just an empty hallway, stretching out into the darkness. Ethan, trying to act brave, stepped forward, shining his flashlight down the corridor. "There's nothing there," he said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. But as soon as he stepped through the doorway, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. "Ethan!" Jess screamed, rushing toward the door and trying to pull it open. But it wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it shut, something stronger than any of us. "Ethan," I yelled, pounding on the door. "Ethan, are you okay?" For a moment there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door, we heard his voice. But it didn't sound right. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice was flat, emotionless. "You should come in here. It's safe." My blood ran cold. I don't know how to explain it, but I knew in that moment that wasn't Ethan. Whatever was on the other side of that door, it wasn't him. It was the house. "We need to get out of here," I said, pulling Jess and Mike away from the door. "Now." We turned and ran, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we stumbled through the shifting hallways. The house was changing faster now, the walls closing in around us, doors appearing and disappearing. Every time we thought we found a way out, the path would shift, trapping us deeper inside. It was like the house didn't want us to leave. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. The house was playing tricks on us, messing with our sense of time and space. All I knew was that the sun would be coming up soon, and we had to get out before then. Mike had told us the house only appeared at night, and I didn't want to find out what would happen if we were still inside when it disappeared. We finally found a staircase that led down, and we took it, hoping it would lead us to the front door. But instead, we ended up in a basement, cold, damp, and filled with strange, old furniture covered in sheets. "We're trapped," Jess whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're never getting out of here." But I wasn't ready to give up. I grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at me. "Yes, we are," I said, my voice shaking. "We just have to keep going." We kept moving, searching for any way out. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, we found it. A small, narrow door hidden behind a stack of old crates. "This has to be it," I whispered. We pulled the door open, and there it was, the front yard, bathed in the soft glow of the rising sun. We ran for it, not daring to look back. As soon as we crossed the threshold, I felt the house shift behind us, like it was collapsing in on itself. We kept running, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods. When we finally turned around, the house was gone. Just like that. Vanished into thin air. We made it back to camp, but things were never the same after that night. Ethan was gone. We never found him, and his voice still haunts me. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear it, calling to me, telling me to come back. But I won't. I don't know what that house was or where it came from, but I do know one thing. It wasn't a place meant for people. It was something else. Something dangerous. And if you ever find yourself in Black Hollow Woods and you see a house that wasn't there before, don't go in. No matter what you hear. No matter what it promises. That's my story. Believe it or not, it's the truth. I still don't fully understand what happened that night, but I do know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to those woods. None of us will. Story team, my name is Alex, and I'll never forget the day we took the forgotten road. It started out like any other road trip. My parents had been planning a vacation for weeks. Just a short getaway, nothing fancy. We were headed to a cabin in the mountains, a nice little spot far from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Just me, my mom, my dad, and my little sister, Emma. We packed up the car early on a Friday morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. My dad was in the driver's seat as usual, and my mom was in the passenger seat, fiddling with the GPS. Emma and I were in the back, arguing over what music to listen to. The drive was supposed to take about 4 hours, but after about 2 hours, traffic started to slow down. There was construction on the main highway, and we were stuck behind a line of cars that seemed to stretch for miles. My dad grumbled under his breath, and after sitting in the stop-and-go traffic for what felt like forever, he made a decision that changed everything. "I'm taking a shortcut," he said, more to himself than to us. My mom glanced at him, a little unsure. "Are you sure? The GPS doesn't show any alternate routes." Dad shrugged. "I saw a road a little ways back. We'll cut through there and bypass all of this." It sounded like a good idea at the time. Anything to get out of that traffic jam. So, when we reached the next turn, my dad took it. A narrow, unmarked road that wound its way through a thick forest. I remember looking out the window, watching the trees blur past, thinking that it was kind of peaceful. The air was cooler here, the sunlight barely breaking through the canopy of leaves overhead. But as we drove deeper into the woods, I started to feel uneasy. There was something about this road that didn't feel right. The trees were too tall, too dense. The sky, once clear and bright, was now hidden by a thick blanket of clouds. "I don't like this road," Emma said softly, hugging her stuffed animal a little tighter. I didn't either, but I didn't say anything. Not yet. We'd been driving for about 30 minutes when I noticed it for the first time. The scenery outside the car hadn't changed. At first I thought I was imagining it, but as I kept watching, I realized I was right. The same group of trees kept passing by over and over again. A tall pine tree with a split trunk, a boulder covered in moss, and a fallen log, always in the same order, like a broken record stuck on repeat. "Dad," I said, my voice uneasy, "we've passed that same tree like 5 times." My dad frowned but didn't say anything. He kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. My mom, sensing something was off, started fiddling with the GPS again. "That's weird," she said, staring at the screen. "It's not showing any road here. It's just blank." "What do you mean blank?" my dad asked, glancing over. "I mean, it's like this road doesn't exist. The GPS isn't picking it up." My dad's jaw tightened. "Maybe it's just out of date. We'll keep going for a bit longer. We're bound to come out somewhere soon." But we didn't. We kept driving. And no matter how far we went, the landscape never changed. The same trees, the same rocks, the same shadows falling across the road. It was like we were trapped in some kind of loop. After another hour of driving with no end in sight, my mom spoke up again. "Maybe we should turn around." "I don't know," my dad started, but my mom cut him off. "Bill, this is getting ridiculous. We're clearly not going anywhere. Let's just turn around and go back to the main road." My dad sighed but finally nodded. He slowed the car down, pulling off to the side of the road so he could make a U-turn. We all held our breath as the car swung around, and for a moment I felt a glimmer of relief. We'd go back, get out of these creepy woods, and forget this weird road ever existed. But as soon as we started driving back the way we came, I knew something was wrong. The trees, they were still the same. The same twisted trunks, the same branches that reached out like skeletal fingers. And then, after about 10 minutes, we passed the same group of trees again. The split pine, the boulder, the fallen log. We were back where we started. "We didn't turn around," Emma whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "We didn't go anywhere." My dad tried again, this time making a complete loop, turning left and right down what looked like smaller side roads. But no matter what he did, no matter how many turns he made, we always ended up back on the same road, passing the same scenery over and over again. Panic was starting to set in. My dad wasn't saying anything anymore, just driving in grim silence, his face pale. My mom kept trying to get the GPS to work, but the screen remained blank, no matter what she did. Emma was curled up next to me, clutching her stuffed bear like it was the only thing keeping her safe. Then, just as the sun began to set, we saw it. A town. It came out of nowhere, emerging from the shadows like a forgotten memory. Old, crumbling buildings lined a narrow street, their windows dark and empty. There were no lights, no cars, no people. Just a town that looked like it had been abandoned for years. "I don't remember seeing this before," I said, staring out the window. "Me neither," my mom whispered. "This wasn't here earlier." But there it was, sitting at the end of the road like it had always been there, waiting for us. "We'll stop here," my dad said quietly. "Maybe there's a phone or something we can use." He pulled the car into the empty street, parking in front of what looked like an old gas station. The sign above the door was faded, the windows covered in grime. The whole place felt wrong, like it was stuck in time, frozen in some long-forgotten past. "We're not getting out, are we?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We'll just take a quick look," my dad said, his voice steady, but I could tell he was scared too. He and my mom got out of the car, leaving me and Emma in the back seat. I watched them walk toward the gas station, their figures disappearing into the shadows. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, Emma grabbed my arm. "Alex, look." I turned to see what she was pointing at, and my heart nearly stopped. There, at the far end of the street, was a figure. It was standing perfectly still, watching us. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, empty eyes. "Mom? Dad?" I shouted, my voice shaking with fear. They came running back to the car, and I pointed toward the figure, but when they looked, it was gone. Just like that. Like it had never been there at all. My dad started the car again, but the engine sputtered and died. He tried again. Nothing. Great, he muttered under his breath. Just great. We were stranded, stuck in an abandoned town with no way out and no way to call for help. We'll have to stay here for the night, my mom said, trying to stay calm. In the car. We'll figure it out in the morning. But deep down, I think we all knew there wouldn't be a morning. Not here. As the night crept in, the darkness seemed to swallow the town whole. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the street like black veins. And then slowly, figures began to emerge from the darkness. At first, they were distant, standing in the windows of the old buildings, watching us. But as the night wore on, they began to move closer, their hollow eyes fixed on our car. I could hear their footsteps, soft, shuffling, like the sound of dry leaves being blown across the pavement. My heart was pounding in my chest, and Emma was crying, holding on to me like her life depended on it. We have to get out of here, I whispered, but there was nowhere to go. At some point during the night, I must have fallen asleep, though I don't remember how. When I woke up, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon, and the figures were gone. The town was silent again, empty, just like before. Dad, I said, shaking him awake. Try the car again. He did, and to my surprise, the engine roared to life. Without a word, my dad slammed his foot on the gas, and we sped out of the town, the tires screeching as we turned back onto the road. My heart was racing, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures chasing after us. But the town disappeared behind us, swallowed by the trees. We never spoke about what happened on that road. Not really. My parents tried to pretend it didn't happen, like it was just a weird fluke, a strange detour that we'd somehow stumbled into. But I know the truth. We weren't just lost, we were trapped. To this day, I can still see that town in my nightmares. The empty streets, the hollow-eyed figures, the feeling that we were being watched, hunted. And I know that somewhere out there, that road is still waiting for the next family to stumble upon it, to take that wrong turn. So, if you ever find yourself on a road that doesn't show up on any map, if you find yourself driving in circles, seeing the same trees over and over again, don't take the shortcut, because you might not come back. Story Fort. My name is Rachel, and this is the story of how my husband Mark and I moved into a house where something dark still lingered. Something that was never supposed to stay. It all started with the house. You know the one. Every town has a place like it. The old rundown house that people whisper about. The one that sits at the end of the street like it's waiting for something. Or someone. That was our house. We just didn't know it when we moved in. Mark and I were newlyweds, eager to start our lives together. We'd been looking for a place to call our own for months, but nothing seemed to fit our budget. Until one day, we stumbled upon the listing for this old Victorian house on Elm Street. It was bigger than anything we'd imagined, with a wraparound porch, tall windows, and more space than we could ever need. The price? Unbelievable. Almost too good to be true. I remember walking through the front door for the first time. The air inside was cool and still, like it had been waiting untouched for years. The floors creaked under our feet, and the walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper. But there was something about it, something that drew us in. It felt like it had history, like it had stories to tell. We signed the papers that same week. It was ours. The first few nights were fine, quiet even. We were too busy unpacking and settling in to notice much. But then, about a week after we moved in, things started happening. Little things at first, things that were easy to brush off. It was the middle of the night when I first heard it. I'd woken up to get a glass of water, my bare feet padding softly across the cold wooden floors. As I reached the kitchen, I heard a faint sound, a soft, distant whisper. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, listening. It was quiet, so quiet that I almost thought I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again. A child's voice. Help, help me. I stood there in the dark, gripping the countertop, my heart racing. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, or maybe the pipes creaking in the old walls. But the voice, it sounded so real. Like someone was standing right there, just out of sight. I went back to bed, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. I didn't tell Mark about it. Not yet. I didn't want him to think I was being paranoid. But the next night, it happened again, the voice in the walls. This time, I wasn't the only one who heard it. Mark and I were sitting in the living room watching TV when we both froze at the same time. The voice, faint but clear, drifted through the air, coming from somewhere behind the walls. "Help me. Please." Mark looked at me, his brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, feeling a chill creep up my spine. "It's the same voice I heard last night." He muted the TV, and we sat in silence, listening. The voice came again, muffled and distant, like it was trapped deep within the walls. "Help me." Mark stood up, moving toward the wall where the sound seemed to be coming from. He pressed his ear against it, his face pale. "There's nothing there," he said after a moment, shaking his head. "It's just an old house, probably just the pipes or something." But I could see the unease in his eyes. He didn't believe what he was saying, and neither did I. The next day, I decided to do some research. There had to be some kind of explanation. Maybe the house had been a boarding school or an orphanage at some point. Something that would explain why we kept hearing a child's voice. I headed to the local library and spent hours digging through old newspapers, property records, anything I could find about the house. And that's when I stumbled across it, the story of a little boy named Daniel Harper. Daniel had lived in the house with his parents in the 1950s. From what I could gather, he was a quiet kid, kept to himself, loved playing hide and seek. But one day, he vanished. Just like that, his parents searched everywhere, but there was no sign of him, no trace. The police were called, but they couldn't find anything either. It was like he disappeared into thin air. The case went cold, and the family eventually moved away, leaving the house empty for years. But the most unsettling part? Daniel was last seen playing in the very same room where Mark and I had been hearing the voice. The same room where he disappeared. That night, I told Mark everything I'd found. He listened quietly, his face pale in the dim light of the living room. We both knew, deep down, that something wasn't right with the house. But neither of us wanted to admit it. Not yet. We tried to ignore the voice, to brush it off as our imaginations playing tricks on us. But it kept coming. Night after night, we'd hear the same desperate pleas for help, always from the same spot, deep within the walls. One evening, Mark decided to take action. "I'm going to tear down that wall," he said, grabbing a crowbar from the garage. "If there's something in there, I'm going to find it." I didn't argue. By this point, I wanted answers just as badly as he did. We moved the furniture aside, clearing the area where the voice seemed to be the strongest. Mark pried open the wall, piece by piece, until we could see the dark, empty space behind it. Dust filled the air, and for a moment, all we could hear was the sound of our own breathing. But there was nothing there. Just an old, empty crawl space. Mark dropped the crowbar, his hands shaking. "It doesn't make any sense," he muttered. But as he said those words, the voice came again, louder this time, more desperate. "Help me, please." We both froze. The sound wasn't coming from the crawl space. It was coming from inside the house. That night, neither of us slept. We stayed up, sitting in the living room with all the lights on, waiting for something, anything to happen. And that's when we saw them. It started with a shadow. Just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, expecting to see Mark, but he was sitting right beside me. The shadow moved again, drifting across the hallway, just beyond the reach of the light. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark nodded, his eyes wide with fear. The shadows began to move faster, darting in and out of the rooms like they were watching us. And then we heard the footsteps. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. The sound of small feet running across the floor above us. Mark grabbed my hand, pulling me close. "We need to get out of here." But as we stood up, the voice came again. This time, it wasn't just a voice, it was a chorus. Multiple voices, all overlapping, all crying out for help. "They're not alone," I whispered, my throat tight with fear. "Daniel, he's not alone." Mark and I stood there, frozen in terror, as the voices grew louder and louder, filling the house with their desperate pleas. The shadows moved faster, circling around us, growing darker, more solid. We ran. We didn't pack. We didn't grab anything. We just ran out the front door, into the cold night air, and didn't stop until we were sitting in the car, the engine running. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the steering wheel. "We can't stay here," Mark said, his voice trembling. "We can't go back." I didn't argue. I put the car in drive, and we sped away from the house as fast as we could. We didn't look back. It's been months since we left that house. We never went back, and we never will. I still hear the voices sometimes, in my dreams. Daniel and the others. The ones who never left. I don't know what happened to him, or why the house is the way it is. But I do know one thing. Whatever is in that house, it's not just a child's spirit, lost and looking for help. There's something darker there. Something that keeps them trapped, that holds them within those walls. And I'm afraid it's still waiting. Waiting for someone else to move in. That's my story. Believe it or not, it's the truth. I've tried to forget, to move on, but I can't shake the feeling that the house isn't done with us yet. I just hope, wherever Daniel is, that he finds peace. Because whatever took him, it's still there. If you ever find yourself drawn to an old house, one that seems too good to be true, one that feels like it's been waiting for you, trust your gut. Some places were never meant to be lived in. Some places are cursed, and the child who never left, he's still waiting. Story 5. My name is Anna, and this is the story of how my shadow, my own shadow, became something much darker. Something that didn't just follow me, but acted on its own. If you're listening to this, take my advice. Never ignore the small things. They might grow into something terrifying. It started so subtly that I almost didn't notice. I just moved into a new apartment, trying to start fresh after a rough breakup. It was a cute place, nothing fancy, just a small one-bedroom with big windows and plenty of light during the day. The kind of place that felt like it had potential to be a real home. I was excited for the change. I remember the first time something felt off. It was late, around midnight, and I was sitting on the couch watching TV, the room lit only by the glow of the screen. The light cast a long shadow behind me, stretching across the floor like it always did. But something was strange. As I shifted on the couch, I noticed my shadow didn't move quite the same way. I shifted left. My shadow shifted, but there was a slight delay, just a fraction of a second, like it was lagging behind. I laughed it off, telling myself I was just tired. Shadows don't move on their own, but that was only the beginning. Over the next few days, things got stranger. I started paying more attention to my shadow. Every time I moved, I felt like it was just a little too slow to follow. Sometimes it seemed to stretch a bit farther than it should, or move in ways that didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I mean, who notices their shadow, right? But one afternoon, something happened that I couldn't explain away. I was in my bedroom, putting away laundry, when I saw it. My shadow, standing on the wall beside me, moved. Only I wasn't moving. I was completely still, staring at the pile of clothes on my bed. But my shadow, it shifted. Its head turned slightly, like it was looking at something behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room. My pulse was racing as I looked back at the wall. The shadow was back to normal, perfectly still, perfectly harmless. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe I had moved without realizing it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that my shadow was watching me. Whenever I walked through my apartment, I felt its presence, like it wasn't just a reflection of me, but something more. Something separate. Then, one night, I got my first real glimpse of what was happening. I was brushing my teeth, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, when I saw it. My shadow, reflected in the dim light of the bathroom, was doing something I wasn't. I was holding the toothbrush in my right hand, brushing slowly, but my shadow, it was holding the toothbrush in its left hand, moving faster, almost aggressively. I froze, staring at the reflection. My shadow's movements grew more violent, more frantic, brushing its teeth with a kind of force that made me feel sick. My own hand was barely moving, but the shadow, it had taken on a life of its own. I dropped the toothbrush, backing away from the mirror. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. "What's happening?" I whispered to myself, my voice trembling, but there was no answer. Just the reflection of my shadow, now still again, standing behind me like nothing had happened. I tried to go on with life as usual, but I couldn't shake the unease that followed me everywhere. My shadow, it wasn't just moving differently. It was acting out things I didn't want to admit. dark thoughts, impulses I kept buried deep inside. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. It started small. I'd be walking down the street, passing people on the sidewalk, and I'd feel this strange pull, a whisper in the back of my mind telling me to push them, to trip them. And while I never acted on it, I'd glance at the ground and see my shadow moving toward theirs, as if it wanted to act on that impulse. One time, I was walking past a man who was standing at the edge of the curb, waiting for the light to change. For a split second, I had this horrible, intrusive thought. What if I pushed him? I didn't. Of course I didn't. But when I looked down at the pavement, I saw my shadow's hand. My shadow's hand, reaching out toward the man's shadow, inches away from pushing him into the street. I yanked my arm back, and my shadow followed, snapping back into place as if nothing had happened. The worse it got, the harder it became to ignore. I could feel my shadow's influence growing, like it was feeding off my darker thoughts, the things I tried to keep hidden, the guilt, the anger, the frustration I'd been holding on to for years. It was using those emotions to take over. It wasn't long before the shadow started moving on its own more frequently, even when I wasn't having those thoughts. I'd catch glimpses of it in the corner of my eye, shifting, twisting into shapes that weren't mine. At night, I'd wake up and see it on the wall, standing there, staring at me, even though I was lying perfectly still in bed. I couldn't escape it. One day, I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. I wasn't even thinking about anything dark, just focused on the task at hand. But when I glanced at the wall, I saw my shadow holding the knife differently, pointed not at the vegetables, but at me. It was slow, deliberate, like it was waiting for me to notice. I dropped the knife, backing away from the counter, my heart racing. I was losing control. My shadow was becoming something separate from me, something dangerous. I didn't know where to turn. Who do you tell when your shadow is acting out your darkest thoughts? How do you explain something like that without sounding insane? I started avoiding mirrors, avoiding places with strong light, anywhere that would make my shadow stand out. But it didn't help. It was always there, always waiting. The breaking point came one night when I was sitting alone in the living room. The lights were dim, and I was trying to read a book, trying to distract myself from the creeping fear that was always with me now. Then, I saw it. My shadow. It wasn't sitting still like I was. It was standing, moving slowly across the wall toward the door. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it reach out, its hand turning the handle. The door creaked open, but I hadn't moved. I was still sitting on the couch, frozen with fear. My shadow was leaving, but it wasn't leaving alone. It was taking me with it. That's when I realized what was happening. My shadow wasn't just acting on its own, it was trying to become me, to take over my life. And if I didn't stop it, it would. I knew I had to confront it. I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep pretending that I wasn't losing control. The more I ignored it, the stronger it became. That night, I stood in front of the mirror, the only light coming from a single lamp behind me. My shadow stood tall on the wall, its edges sharp and dark, almost too real. It was no longer just a reflection of me, it was something else entirely. "I know what you are," I whispered, my voice shaking. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. "I won't let you take over." As the words left my mouth, the shadow twitched, its form shifting, becoming darker, more twisted. I watched in horror as it started to change, its arms lengthening, its shape warping into something monstrous. But I stood my ground. I had to. This thing, it was a part of me, a part I'd been hiding for too long. The anger, the guilt, the pain I'd buried over the years, it had fed my shadow, made it strong. And now it was time to face it. I took a deep breath, staring into the mirror. "You're me," I said, my voice steady. "But you don't control me." For a moment, the shadow hesitated. It flickered, like it was fighting back, trying to hold on to its power. But I didn't look away. I wouldn't let it win. Slowly, the shadow began to shrink, its edges softening. It wasn't easy, and I could feel the weight of all those dark thoughts pressing down on me, trying to pull me under. But I didn't give in. I kept telling myself that I was in control, that the shadow was just that, a shadow, nothing more. And finally, after what felt like hours, the shadow returned to its normal shape. Just a shadow. Just me. It's been a few months since that night, and things have gotten better. My shadow is back to being what it's supposed to be, a quiet, passive part of me. But every now and then, I still catch it moving out of the corner of my eye, like it's reminding me that it's still there, waiting. I've learned a lot from all of this. We all have shadows, both the ones we see and the ones we carry inside. The darkest parts of ourselves, the things we try to bury and forget, they never really go away. They follow us, waiting for the right moment to take control. So if you ever feel like your shadow is moving when you're not, or if it feels just a little too real, maybe it's time to face the things you've been hiding. Because if you don't, your shadow just might take over. And trust me, you don't want that. That's my story. I don't know if you believe me or not, but I swear, every word of it is true. Take care of your shadows. Story scene. My name is Lily, and I want to warn you. Sometimes, mirrors don't just reflect what's in front of them. Sometimes, they show things that you're not supposed to see. It all started about a year ago, right after we moved into this old house. It wasn't anything special, just a typical two-story place on a quiet street. My parents had bought it because it was cheap, which should have been my first clue that something wasn't quite right. But I didn't think much of it at the time. I was more focused on getting settled into my new room, dealing with starting at a new school, and all the usual teenage stuff. One afternoon, a few weeks after we'd moved in, I was up in the attic looking for some old books my mom had asked me to find. The attic was a mess, full of dusty boxes, old furniture, and random junk left behind by the previous owners. It was dimly lit, with only a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the room. The air smelled musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I was rummaging through a pile of old boxes when something caught my eye. An old mirror leaning against the far wall, half covered by an old sheet. It was large, much bigger than any mirror I'd ever seen before, with an ornate gold frame that looked like something straight out of an antique store. The design was intricate, swirling patterns carved into the wood, and there was something about it that drew me in. I pulled the sheet off, coughing as a cloud of dust rose into the air. Beneath the grime, the glass of the mirror was perfectly smooth, like it hadn't aged a day. It was strange because everything else in the attic looked like it had been sitting there for decades, but the mirror, it looked untouched. Pristine. I stared at my reflection, tilting my head slightly. Everything seemed normal. Just me, standing there in the dusty attic. But something about the mirror gave me the creeps, like there was something off that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I shook it off. It was just an old mirror after all. Nothing special. A few days later, I decided to bring the mirror down from the attic and put it in my room. My bedroom was kind of bare, and I thought the mirror would add a nice touch. Plus it was old and unique, definitely cooler than the boring, modern mirrors you'd find at the store. I figured it would fit right in with my eclectic collection of books and vintage posters. At first, everything seemed fine. I hung the mirror on the wall across from my bed, where I could see it whenever I woke up. But after a few days, I started to notice something strange. It was little things at first, just fleeting moments where my reflection didn't seem quite right. Like I'd turn my head, but my reflection would lag behind for just a split second, as if the glass was slow to catch up. Or sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror out of the corner of my eye, and it felt like my reflection was watching me. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but it was this subtle, unsettling feeling that I couldn't shake. One night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I glanced over at the mirror. My reflection was staring back at me, like it always did. But something was different. My reflection was sitting up, even though I was lying down. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I blinked, thinking maybe I was just tired, maybe I was seeing things. But when I looked again, the reflection was still sitting there, watching me. Okay, that's enough, I whispered to myself, sitting up and turning away from the mirror. I didn't look at it again that night. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. The mirror seemed to loom larger than ever, dominating the space in my room. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every time I caught a glimpse of it, I felt like my reflection was moving differently, subtly, just enough to mess with my head. It was like the mirror was playing games with me. A few days later, things got worse. I was getting ready for school, standing in front of the mirror, brushing my hair. As I pulled the brush through my hair, I noticed something odd. My reflection was smiling, but I wasn't. My hand froze mid-brush, and I stared at the reflection, my skin prickling with fear. The smile was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. This twisted, knowing grin that didn't belong on my face. I dropped the brush and backed away from the mirror, my heart racing. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My reflection's smile widened, and then, just for a split second, it waved. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't tell anyone about what was happening. I mean, how could I? How do you tell someone that your reflection is acting on its own, that it's smiling and waving and doing things you're not doing? No one would believe me. They'd think I was crazy. So, I kept it to myself, even though the fear was gnawing at me. A week went by, and things only got worse. I started having nightmares, dreams where I was trapped in the mirror, banging on the glass, screaming for someone to let me out. In the dreams, my reflection was living my life, taking my place. I'd watch from behind the glass as it walked around in my body, pretending to be me. And no one could tell the difference. No one knew it wasn't me. But the worst part, I started to wonder if it wasn't just a dream. One afternoon, I came home from school and went straight to my room. The moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. My room, it looked the same, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the air was different. Like the whole place was tilted ever so slightly, like it wasn't my room anymore. I glanced at the mirror, and there it was, my reflection, standing perfectly still, staring back at me. But this time, it didn't move when I moved. I raised my hand to wave, but my reflection didn't copy me. Instead, it tilted its head, that same twisted smile creeping across its face. I tried to avoid the mirror as much as possible after that. I'd cover it with a blanket, leave the lights off, anything to avoid seeing my reflection. But it didn't matter. The nightmares kept coming, and every time I looked at the mirror, I could feel my reflection getting stronger, more real. One night, everything changed. I was sitting at my desk doing homework when I heard a sound behind me. A soft, muffled tapping like someone was knocking on glass. My stomach dropped. I turned slowly, my eyes locking onto the mirror. My reflection wasn't sitting at the desk like I was. It was standing right behind me, its hand pressed against the inside of the glass, tapping, tap, tap, tap. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The reflection's smile widened. Slowly, it raised its hand and pointed at me, and then, in a voice that was both mine and not mine, it spoke. "I want your life." Before I could react, the reflection lunged forward, pressing its hands against the glass, harder and harder. The surface of the mirror rippled, like the glass was turning to water. I stumbled back, but it was too late. The reflection reached out, grabbing my wrist, pulling me toward the mirror. I screamed, struggling to break free, but its grip was too strong. The glass felt cold and sharp against my skin as it dragged me closer. I could feel myself being pulled into the mirror, into that twisted, parallel life, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I saw what was waiting for me on the other side. An empty world, dark and hollow, where I would be trapped forever. With one last burst of strength, I yanked my arm free and stumbled back, crashing into my desk. The reflection froze, its eyes narrowing in anger. Slowly, it faded back into the glass, but not before whispering one last thing. "I'll be back." I don't know how I managed to get rid of that mirror. I don't even remember how I did it. All I know is that I wrapped it in the thickest blanket I could find, dragged it up to the attic, and shoved it into the darkest corner, hoping that would be enough to keep it at bay. It's been a few months now, and things have mostly gone back to normal. The nightmares have stopped, and I've stopped seeing things in mirrors. But every now and then, I still feel that familiar chill, that creeping sense that I'm being watched. Sometimes when I walk past the attic door, I hear a faint tapping, like someone knocking on glass, and I know deep down that it's still there, waiting, watching. So, if you ever come across an old mirror, one that feels a little too perfect, a little too still, leave it alone. Don't make the same mistake I did, because some reflections, they don't want to stay reflections. They want your life. That's my story. Believe it if you want, but I swear it's true. Keep an eye on your mirrors. You never know what might be staring back.